Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed.
You're listening to Amateur Traveler, episode 115. Today on the Amateur Traveler, we talk about Sweden. Learn about Stockholm, where you can trace your Swedish roots, and where you can get a very cold drink. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have two news stories for you today in the Amateur Traveler. The first one being very useful and the second one very strange. The first one is an article from Travel Hacker, and it's the 10 useful secrets that major airlines don't want you to know. This is a real good article for you to read if you're going to be booking your airfare. It talks about Rule 240, which is a rule that some airlines have, not all, that is what do they need to do if something goes wrong with the flight? What do they need to do for compensation? And then it also talks about getting better travel deals and getting first-class seats at coach prices. So check out the links in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com to that article. The second one is a strange story. How would you like to stay, as in hotel stay, in a drain pipe? Well, that's the opportunity you can have if you go to Austria's Das Park Hotel. It stands in a lovely location near the Danube in a municipal camping area, and its rooms built out of giant concrete sewage pipe segments. Each of these sewage pipe segments, now hotel rooms, has a digital keypad lock to protect it, that you can get the code for it from the website automatically. And inside you'll find a bed with a sleeping bag, a place to plug in your electronics, a lamp, and not much else. We're talking low frills here. I'll put a picture to this in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome onto the show Sean Whiting, who's come to talk to us about Sweden. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, you are in Sweden while we talk.
I am here now in the wintertime in the darkness of Sweden.
And you say the darkness of Sweden. What time is it right now?
Well, right now it's about 5:15 in the afternoon. Sun's been down for a couple hours at this point. So perhaps as we go through this interview, you'll find that climate and weather and the contrast of darkness and light really kind of influence the whole experience of being this far north, of course.
Okay. Now, what brought you to Sweden originally? You're obviously not Swedish, or at least not
No,
born in
I am
Sweden.
not Swedish. I don't have any Swedish blood. That's a popular question when I'm here. But I grew up in Southern California, but then spent many years in Seattle and eventually took a job with a company here in Sweden and have been here about a year and a half.
If we were to come to Sweden for, say, a week to visit, what would you recommend we do? Where would we go?
I certainly think any visit to Sweden, you need to focus on Stockholm, which is the capital, and the self-proclaimed capital of Scandinavia. And it's just kind of the central spot that you probably want to work off of. Stockholm has a whole lot to offer. I will certainly say that for someone coming from North America who has never been to Europe, I would not want to say a blanket statement that you should absolutely come to Sweden first. There is certainly France and Italy and some of these other places that Americans in particular really love to go, and for good reason. But I think to the maybe more experienced traveler, someone who's looking for something kind of unique and new and just a little bit different, that Scandinavia in general, and certainly Sweden within that, is a great option. I liken it kind of to, if you're going to go to the U.S., you're probably going to go to New York and Chicago and some of these big, huge cities. And if you're going to go to Europe, you're probably going to go to London and Paris and some of these other great places. But if you have an interest in, say, the natural world and just something that, say, if you were in the U.S., might lead you to go north to Canada or up even to Alaska, the nature and just kind of the pristine, sort of untouched beauty of the location, those are kind of some of the same motivations that might bring somebody to Sweden. There's just a ton of nature and beauty. Stockholm, for instance, is a city built on 14 different islands. There's a lot of cities I've found, certainly in the north of Europe, that call themselves the Venice of the North because there's canals and bridges and water everywhere. Amsterdam says that about itself, and a few other cities. But Stockholm does as well, because everywhere you look, there's either kind of these grand, distinguished, or elegant almost buildings or water. And that just makes for a very, very beautiful place to go visit, whether it's winter or particularly in the summer.
And let's talk a little bit about time to go there. I would think that this isn't necessarily the most recommended time to go to Sweden when it gets dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
I would agree with you, Chris. I would say that the big advantage this time of year is that airline travel is a little cheaper than it is, obviously, at the prime time. But no, certainly my first recommendation for anyone coming this far north is to come during the summertime, because you just have seemingly endless daylight. And even when it's dark, it's kind of just a blue dusk. It's not really pitch black. There were almost 2 months this summer that I was here where I didn't really see pitch black nighttime. It was just kind of this dusk. And I'm actually in the southern part of Sweden, like most people in Sweden. We're in the southern part. If you go further north, there is the 24-hour daylight, midnight sun effect. And that's part of the reason why a lot of people, I think, come to Sweden and certainly over to Norway, is just that beautiful experience of hiking at midnight.
I was talking to someone this week who was talking about going to a hotel in southern Sweden, I believe, and that they had, I think, 3 sets of curtains. And he didn't understand why they had these big blackout curtains until it stayed light till 1 and then got darkish, and then the sun came up at 3. So
Yeah, and it just influences kind of your whole outlook and everything you do. And so it's just a unique part, is certainly of moving somewhere this far north, is the whole experience of light and dark. The winter, as opposed to what some people might think, the winter really isn't all that bad. You just kind of put on a jacket and you're okay, at least in southern Sweden. But the thing that will get you sometimes is certainly the dark and the light, depending what time of year you're here. And that's really the influencer of so much here in Sweden.
is the culture, I mean, when you're a local there or a temporary local like you are, does it change a lot from summer to winter in terms of what people are doing and I mean, obviously the weather's changing too, but
No. I for sure have had the experience where there's so much that is dictated by just kind of the climate. The two biggest holidays are right smack dab in the middle of winter, which is Santa Lucia Day. And then there's the midsummer celebration, which is the summer solstice, and that's obviously the opposite in June.
Right.
And that's definitely a recommended time to be here. If there's anybody listening who has a chance to be here right around the summer solstice, that is Swedes at their celebratory finest. It's where the real kind of Scandinavian sense of community comes through the most.
And what sort of things are going on at that time then?
Well, the classic kind of midsummer celebration certainly takes place in the countryside. It is definitely a time where you want to find some people that certainly are familiar with Sweden, if not locals themselves. So it could take some planning. Let me see how to explain midsummer. It's such a unique time. Well, certainly the sun is up most of the day. They have the celebration around a maypole. There's just lots of traditional dancing and singing and songs. All this is usually taking place close to water. Swedes are very, very fond of the water, and there's just so much coastline. There's a real strong kind of sailing culture and just culture around the water in the summertime. And there's just kind of an overall sense of family and togetherness and community, and just something very compelling about being here around that time when kind of the Swedish personality is coming out, and there's just this real excitement around the sun and around light returning again. Being from Southern California, that was a real unique part of my first experience here, is just seeing just how much is dictated by this darkness and light thing.
Okay. And we were talking a little bit about Stockholm before we went astray there for a little bit. What else would you recommend we see in Stockholm or do?
There's a few must-dos in Stockholm. I would say that the first thing that probably most people coming, especially if you've come across the Atlantic, would be Gamla stan, and that's the Swedish term for the Old Town. And the Old Town was obviously founded I believe, in the 14th century, and just kind of displays a lot of the normal characteristics that you might find in a European Old Town, whether it's the cobblestone streets and the very narrow pathways, and there's parts of it that are somewhat touristy, and even those are kind of fun for the visitor and stuff. So there is Gamla stan, which is really kind of the heart and what all the different neighborhoods from Stockholm are connected to. The other part is actually the more natural neighborhood or area of Stockholm that has been really kind of set apart. And its primary location a visitor might want to go on the island of Djurgården, D-G-U-R, Garden, is Skansen. Skansen, Skansen. And that is basically this outdoor heritage museum of the Swedish culture.
Okay.
Swedes will say that is the very first outdoor museum in all of Europe. It's been there about 115 years, I believe. And what you'll find there is just this great collection of life as it was found in Sweden in the mid-1800s. So whether it's a farmhouse and characters dressed in period attire to tell you what life was like in Sweden at that time, there's cafes and shops and bakeries and just everything that kind of transports you back. And it's not necessarily geared towards the out-of-country tourist. It's certainly something that is meant to help Swedes remember their past as well, but it's, of course, meant for everybody. And a very interesting look at just this classic Swedish image that you might have. And it's certainly something that's enjoyable each season of the year. So I highly recommend Skansen for just kind of a real vintage Swedish cultural experience. And then just getting to know the different neighborhoods. There is a Södermalm area, which has a lot of different places to stay, whether it be for the budget traveler or whether it be for your more pricier experience of Stockholm. And then just kind of becoming familiar with all the different neighborhoods. One thing I really recommend, especially if you were to come in the summertime, is to get out to the Swedish archipelago, which is just a collection of islands out about depending on what kind of boat or travel that you have, could be anywhere from a 45-minute boat ride to a 3-hour boat ride away from Stockholm.
Okay.
It's literally a collection of 24,000 islands, some of which you can step on and just kind of dance across, and others that may have hotels on them. If you had a really good map of the Swedish archipelago, it would look like just shattered glass with all different shapes and sizes of these different rocks or then islands. And it certainly is a popular place for Swedes to go in the summertime, and certainly for tourists as well. But the Swedish archipelago is a real strong part of the summertime culture in Sweden.
Okay, interesting. Now, you talked about budget travelers here. One thing that my understanding is with Sweden, especially eating out, can be a bit pricey.
Yes, and you've heard right.
Okay.
I would say that your basic meal probably would run for dinner time would run anywhere from $30 to $40, and that's without alcohol. If you add in alcohol, it's going to be significantly more because alcohol is a bit pricey.
Per person?
Certainly. Per person.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You can kind of get away with some things for breakfast and lunch like the budget traveler might be used to doing, but to sit down and have a legitimate meal of substance at dinner time, yeah, I would say that you want to budget $30 to $40 per person for some of these meals. But they are worth it, and there's some good Swedish cuisine, which includes a lot of different kinds of fish, a lot of different kinds of meat, certainly potatoes. One of the things that's interesting about Sweden is that they regularly consume reindeer. It's actually a real delicacy. So if you can get over the whole Bambi or Rudolph thing, I highly recommend. Yes, I highly recommend the reindeer. It's kind of funny.
Okay. And my understanding is that lodging is not as unusually expensive. It's more the meals, and that Swedes don't tend to eat out as much.
Yeah, that I would say that's true.
Okay.
A Swedish experience is certainly also eating in and kind of that family and community aspect as well. But there are certainly ways that you can get away with some thoughtful and reasonable lodging, particularly in Stockholm. A place I would certainly want to recommend the most is called the A.F. Chapman Boat and Hostel.
Right.
And that's not just for the budget traveler. I would say that they are very welcoming of all sorts of different types of people. But this is actually a boat which is located right in the center of Stockholm, right across from the old town, as I mentioned. And it's actually, so it's a boat, and all the rooms are kind of below sea level. So it's just this kind of unique and exciting place to stay, and then got all the facilities and good people. And it's on the top of most lists of people who are recommending if you want to stay for a reasonable price in Stockholm. As you kind of move up the chain, there's plenty of different types of places to stay. One unique thing about Stockholm is that so many of the kind of higher-priced hotels are geared towards the Sunday night through Thursday night businessman or woman. And so that makes sometimes on weekends you can get to Stockholm if there's not a festival or something big happening, which in the summertime you want to be aware of before you get there. But that makes the hotels for the weekends for someone coming through a little bit more affordable. Say a $300 place you might be able to get for $150 or something like that for two people. And so there are some tricks, but you do want to be planful when you're coming to Sweden like this because it can be a little bit pricier.
Okay. So our biggest budget tip is make friends with Swedes and get invited over for dinner then.
Yes. Okay. If you make friends with Swedes, you are set. And that's another thing I wanted to say is that there are so many people I know in North America that have Swedish heritage.
Sure.
And it may be going back a long way, but anybody named Anderson or Hansen or something like that would have perhaps some Swedish or even Norwegian heritage. And if those people, I would say in particular, to come back to the motherland, if you will, I think can be a really rewarding experience. I haven't had that experience. I am not Swedish or Scandinavian in any way, but I've heard of many people. It's like when I said I was coming here, friends and kind of acquaintances kind of came out of the woodwork saying, I have an uncle there, or I have somebody else there, or I'm from there. And just half those people decided to come here and actually discover the roots. I think it would be an extra special experience of travel.
Okay. Anything else in the Stockholm area that you would recommend that we see before we look a little further afield?
My biggest thing is just to kind of come and experience the different, it's kind of 4 or 5 main neighborhoods in the central Stockholm area. And I think that walking around, you just experience these very elegant, is the word that always comes to mind, or distinguished buildings and the water and everything. So nothing else in particular to come and explore on your own. Okay. There's also a royal palace that you can go and visit were the royal family of Sweden, which Sweden still has the royal family that you can go and visit via boat, actually, in the summertime. So maybe going out to Drottningholm Palace would be another option for the traveler.
Okay. And then you know that one of the questions I usually ask is, what do the guidebooks recommend and say you should spend your time at that you think is just kind of a little bit of a waste of time?
Sure. There's not necessarily... I go to some of these, perhaps these other European cities, and you can always kind of pick out the one real big tourist trap that is just surrounded by people, and I just love to go to those places and actually look at the tourists rather than what they're looking at, because they are much more entertaining usually than the thing that they might be observing. I can't really point out any one place. Maybe the main street in this old town of Stockholm would be the place to be aware that you will be a tourist and there probably won't be too many Swedes around you.
Okay.
In just thinking about this overall, I actually look on a guidebook that I use regularly, and that's certainly the Lonely Planet guidebook for Sweden. And right there on the cover is the Ice Hotel.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay.
The Ice Hotel is funny because it's something that I heard all about before I got to Sweden. And I realized I haven't heard a thing about the Ice Hotel from actual Swedes who are here and everything. So right there on the cover of the Lonely Planet guidebook is the Ice Hotel, and I think they're just trying to capture that unique, pristine beauty. But that's a long, long, long way north. I mean, that would be a full weekend commitment to get up there. And most people, kind of like the example you used, Chris, for coming for a week, you wouldn't want to spend half that week just getting up to, say, the Ice Hotel, particularly because in the summertime it wouldn't even be there, of course. But I would say that's kind of something to be aware of. There's actually a nice little substitute in Stockholm called the Ice Bar that you can go to, and you pay, I think, $15 fee for getting in, and it provides you with a jacket and mittens and gloves, and you go into this very unique bar where everything is made of ice, and you can order a drink, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, and that might be a pretty good substitute. But other than that, I can't really think of anything in particular that would be a tourist trap that you want to be aware of before coming.
Okay. And then the opposite question, what did you learn about from the locals that tourists just miss and would thoroughly enjoy if they knew about it?
Again, I come back to this idea of kind of this unique Scandinavian community. If you come to Sweden and don't kind of experience some of the small town countryside charm of some of the smaller cities, that's really an important part of it.
And we should say you're not actually living in Stockholm.
Exactly. No, I'm not. I'm 2 hours south of Stockholm, and while my work takes me up to Stockholm for both business and pleasure, I am living 2 hours south of Stockholm in a smaller town called Linköping. And it is kind of your classic smaller by world standards. I'm careful with that because Swedes are quick to tell me that it's very large by Swedish standards. But this city of Linköping is a classic smaller town in Sweden. And I think any trip to Sweden, you want to experience Stockholm and maybe one of the other more larger cities. There's Gothenburg on the west coast, and also Malmo, which is down by Copenhagen and actually makes for a good stop on a trip as well. But to miss some of these smaller towns like, say, Kalmar. Kalmar is down on the southern coast of Sweden and is very historical and has a castle there that was used during the Swedish dynastic era and is right on the water, and just a beautiful, another good example of a kind of a smaller Swedish town that you might want to come to and just spend a little time with some locals. Everyone's very courteous and friendly. English is spoken everywhere by just about everybody. In fact, it's perfect for a tourist coming through because you don't have to know any Swedish and you're really not expected to. But for someone like myself, a temporary local who wants to respect the culture and have the experience of learning a new language, it makes it very, very hard to actually be able to confidently speak the language when everybody speaks to you in English. So that's a little tip if somebody is coming up here expecting to learn some Swedish one way or another. If you know English and they know you know English, it's going to make it difficult to get some good practice in Swedish.
And then you say the Swedish dynastic era. So we're going to do a little Swedish history quiz of one of us here right now. Are we talking about the era of like Gustavus Adolphus in the 1600s? Or are we talking about back when Sweden was ruling Russia or before then?
Nice reference with both of those, Chris. I'm impressed with the crack research staff at Amateur Traveler.
I just remember things.
We're talking about both of those. I believe the castle was kind of at its peak in the 1600s, if I remember correctly. So right around then, when Sweden and Denmark weren't so friendly, and when the countries of the Baltic didn't have a nice peace about them.
Right, 30 Years' War, right around then.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
So as far as coming, that maybe I think the guidebooks actually probably do a pretty good job of this, but just making sure that you experience some of the smaller towns. If you're going to Stockholm, then probably the best experience of what I'm talking about is to head north about a 20-minute train ride to the actual university town of Uppsala, Uppsala, Uppsala. There's a 700-year-old university there. That's a good sort of smaller town feel of Sweden.
Okay. When you moved there, what was the biggest surprise? You thought you knew Sweden, but what really came as a surprise was what?
That's a good question. To be quite honest, I came and I really, really wanted to be culturally sensitive. And I really wanted to be aware of differences that there would be between myself as an American and then coming to Sweden. What I found were those differences per se were not quite as stark or as strong. There's more subtle differences than you might find, say, in going to some of these other European countries that, we might be more familiar with and know that there are very, very strong contrasts between perhaps how we go about things. In Sweden, there's just a subtlety to it. So for me, trying to be overly sensitive in a way, I was a little caught off guard when, things weren't quite as different as perhaps I was expecting or had kind of been led to believe in some ways. So that was a bit of a surprise. I just find the Swedish people to be extremely, just very down to earth and very sensible, very aware, if you will, of the world around them and their place with it, very content in kind of the piece of the world that they have really carved out for themselves up here. I would say just culturally, that's perhaps a little bit different than what I'm used to in the U.S., but that just kind of contentness and that overall community feeling of being up here is a real rewarding part. So just maybe the difference in cultures in that way was the surprising part, if you will, from your question.
Okay. How about one day where you woke up here in the last year or so and said, thank God I live in Sweden now?
There's been more than one day, I should say,
right.
that I didn't, that I woke up and said that, but I've really enjoyed my experience. I would say that the experience of those holidays that I spoke of, whether you're in the middle of winter or the middle of summer, I explained a little bit about midsummer, and coming up here in the next couple weeks on December 13th will be Santa Lucia Day. And, I just think that to be in one of these beautiful old Gothic cathedrals that is absolutely packed with people, and in a smaller city like Linköping, you know that 99% of those people are actually Swedes. And so for a foreigner to be in a place in a country where you know that everybody else there is native and is also 100% Sweden, and their parents were, and their parents were, and their parents were. To be in an old cathedral like that, there's so many people that are there, and then to have the Santa Lucia celebration where generally you have children that are dressed in white, and there's always the Lucia who is actually wearing a crown of candles. Usually those are electric, depending on the environment that they are in, but every once in a while they can also be actual real candles. And then there's a bunch of traditional songs that the choir, or in this case the children's choir, will sing. And to just see that whole atmosphere of this celebration of light in the middle of the darkest time of year, and to see the whole community coming together around that, I think is just so unique to this part of the world, and just such a good expression of this idea of the Scandinavian community. I'd say that is a time when I just kind of say, thank God I'm able to experience this. Thank God I live in Sweden.
Okay. Anything else? You've got, I'm sure, lots of other things to tell us, and unfortunately we're running out of time here. The one last thing that we really can't stop talking about Sweden without mentioning this. I hear you ruffling your notes there, trying to figure out what it is.
Yes, trying just to decide here. I would say that just for travelers, perspective, the train system is fantastic. You can get to almost any city by train. You may want to grab a rental car if you're going to tour, say, the Glass Kingdom. Costa Boda and Urafors are worldwide well-known places in Sweden's famous Glass Kingdom. That's also the place that you want to go if you do have some heritage or ancestors from Sweden, because the city of Växjö, which to an American or an English speaker would look like Vaxjo. The city of Växjö has the Immigrant Museum, which you can look up. You can look up your ancestors and spend a long time just tracing records and looking back at different things. And that's all together, the Glass Kingdom and the Immigrant Museum there. And a very, I think, again, a meaningful part for the person who has some Swedish heritage. The last thing I would want to make sure that people are aware of and would want to experience is, in a sense, akin to the British tea time, is the Swedish fika. That's Fika, and that is your 2 times daily coffee break, but it's a little bit more than that. It's coffee and pastries and colleagues stopping whatever they're doing and coming together to have their break and enjoy one another. So if you're in Sweden, you're going to hear a lot just about fika and stopping what you're doing during the day, whether you're working or playing, and just taking what we might best be described as a coffee break, but it's really kind of more of perhaps a almost appreciation of the moment or a celebration around being able to take a break and just have some coffee together and pastries. And it's just kind of a unique thing to Sweden, and something that I think a lot of travelers or tourists, or for myself, a temporary local, kind of get a kick out of and appreciate along with the Swedes. So definitely know the word fika before you come to Sweden.
All right. Thank you so much for coming and sharing a little bit about your current home in Sweden. You have a blog. Why don't you tell us again where that is?
Yes, the blog, you can be found at Linköping Livin. I will spell that because it sounds a little different than it sounds. Linkoping. So it looks like Linkoping, but it's pronounced Linköping. Livin, Livin, without the G. Linköpinglivin.blogspot.com. And that's just kind of a blog about my experience here in Linköping, but actually after it was featured in the local newspaper here, there were some Swedes that became aware of it and kind of enjoyed looking at their country through the eyes of, in this case, an American. So there's some Swedish readers and certainly some American readers, and it's just kind of a fun place to look at Swedish culture. It's kind of evolved into that. So, yeah.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show. And I'll put a link, obviously, to your blog in the show notes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Chris, very much.
I have one resource for you today in the Internet Resources section of the show, and that's one actually that I used earlier in the show for that story about staying in a sewer pipe. This is the Unusual Hotels of the World, UHOTW.com, and this particular site lists all sorts of bizarre and strange things, from relatively normal, like staying in a lighthouse, to staying in a desert oasis, to staying in a cave, to staying in historic sites, but also to stay on unusual floating boats and all kinds of different places. So I think you'll enjoy this one. So check out Unusual Hotels of the World, UHOTW.com. In news from the community, Jerry posted on the discussion boards that he and his wife are getting ready to leave for a 2.5-week trip on a cruise around Patagonia, leaving from Buenos Aires and returning Christmas Day. They are doing a short excursion to King George's Island, but he points out that they are flying. I don't know if you remember the news story about the ship that just sunk near King George's Island. So they'll be doing a quick touchdown in Antarctica. And his question was, how do you pack a single suitcase for balmy Buenos Aires and frigid Antarctica? So be interested to see, Jerry, how that worked out for you. I had some feedback on my question about the enhanced version of the show. Dave wrote from New York City saying, really enjoy the podcast. Please keep the enhanced version as it is. Your photos really help enhance your interviews. I wish more travel podcasts took time to do this. I know It is a lot of work, and I appreciate your efforts. Thanks, Dave. It does take a lot of work, although actually not quite as much work as editing out about 5 minutes on average from every show. That just cleans up the ums and the ahs, both from myself as well as from the guest. I'm still waiting to hear back from the winners of Andrew Darlow's book, 301 Inkjet Tips and Techniques, an Essential Printing Resource for Photographers. When I hear back from them, I'll announce it, but I, at this point, may have to pick another name or two. So it may not be too late to enter the contest by either joining the mailing list or posting something on the discussion boards at amateurtraveler.com/board. I do need your help. If you would, I need people to go to iTunes and review the podcast because I don't have enough reviews recently, and so I've dropped off the list of the top 15 podcasts in the travel area, and more reviews will help me show back up there, and that helps get visibility that drives more listeners to the show. So if you have time to do that, I would appreciate it. And with that, if you have any questions about this or any show, drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. or call me on the comment line at 408-8494-POD. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Podshow, and Limelight.